Sometimes the hardest part of losing someone isn't saying goodbye. It's learning to live with the questions they leave behind. Dr. Marjorie Lane had spent 30 years trying to forget the mysteries surrounding her husband's death, finding peace in her quiet retirement from veterinary practice. When her neighbor's cat started acting strange, she thought helping would be simple. The tabby was hiding, refusing food, and crying at night. But when Marjorie examined the animal, she found an old surgical scar hidden beneath its fur. Inside was a tiny capsule containing a message written in her dead husband's handwriting. The words on that paper brought back memories she had buried and secrets that had torn her marriage apart. Now she faced an impossible question. How can a dead man leave messages in living animals? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Marjorie Lane's kitchen window, casting delicate shadows across the worn oak table where she sat, with her coffee growing cold. At 73, she had learned to appreciate these quiet moments before the world stirred to life. The house on Maple Street had been her sanctuary for over 4 decades, though it felt considerably larger since Thomas passed away 30 years ago. She reached for the small wooden box that sat beside her place setting, a ritual she'd maintained every morning since his funeral. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay 2 wedding rings, hers, which she'd removed the day after the burial, and his, which had been returned to her by the county coroner, along with his other personal effects. The gold had dulled over the decades, but she could still read the inscription they'd chosen together. 2 hearts, 1 practice. How naive they'd been, she thought, running her thumb over the engraved words. They'd believed their love could weather anything. Long hours at the clinic, financial struggles, even the gradual distance that had crept into their marriage during those final years. They'd been wrong about the distance part. The veterinary practice they'd built together had been more than a business. It had been their shared dream. The Lane Animal Clinic had served Millbrook and the surrounding farming communities for nearly 20 years. She could still picture Thomas in his white coat, his gentle hands examining a frightened puppy or coaxing medication down a stubborn cat's throat. He'd had a gift with animals that bordered on magical. They seemed to sense his compassion before. He even touched them, but toward the end, something had changed. Thomas became secretive, taking calls late at night and leaving for emergency visits that he never fully explained. When she'd ask about his day, his answers grew shorter, his smiles forced. She'd assumed it was stress from the practice, or perhaps a midlife crisis. Now, sitting in the same kitchen where they'd shared thousands of meals, she wondered if she'd ever really known her husband at all. The sound of Mrs. Henderson's back, Dr. slamming shut, drew Marjorie from her reverie. Eleanor Henderson had been her neighbor for 15 years, a widow herself who understood the peculiar loneliness that settled over a house meant for 2. At 81, Eleanor still maintained her garden with the precision of a military operation and kept watch over the neighborhood with the vigilance of a seasoned detective. Marjorie glanced at the clock. 7:30 a.m. Right on schedule, Eleanor would be checking her mailbox, watering her roses, and scanning the street for anything amiss. It was Eleanor who'd knocked on her door 3 days ago, wringing her hands and speaking in the rapid-fire cadence that indicated genuine distress. "Marjorie, I hate to bother you, but it's Whiskers. He's not himself at all. Won't eat, won't come when I call, and he's been crying all night. Keeps me awake with the most pitiful sounds. I know you're retired, but could you possibly take a look? The new vet in town charges a fortune, and frankly, he doesn't have your touch." Whiskers, a orange tabby with white markings, had been Eleanor's constant companion since her husband died 6 years ago. The cat was typically social and well-behaved, often seen sunning himself on Eleanor's front porch or following her around the garden like a devoted dog. For him to suddenly become withdrawn was indeed concerning. Marjorie had agreed to examine Whiskers that afternoon, though she'd been reluctant. Retirement had been a conscious choice, a way to step back from the emotional demands of caring for sick animals and the weight of life and death decisions. At her age, she preferred the predictability of her daily routines: morning coffee, afternoon reading, evening television, and early bed. The drama of veterinary emergencies belonged to her past. She'd closed the practice 5 years after Thomas's death, unable to continue alone in the space that held so many memories of their partnership. The building now housed a small antique shop, though she still drove past it occasionally and could swear she heard the phantom echoes of barking dogs and meowing cats. The retirement years had been peaceful, if somewhat solitary. She'd joined the local book club, volunteered at the library, and maintained a small garden that provided more satisfaction than she'd expected. Friends from church checked on her regularly, and Eleanor's presence next door provided a comfortable sense of community. It wasn't the life she'd envisioned at 30, but it was a good life nonetheless. Her thoughts were interrupted by a gentle knock at the kitchen door. Through the glass, she could see Eleanor holding a pet carrier, her silver hair already perfectly styled despite the early hour. "I'm sorry to come by so early," Eleanor said as Marjorie opened the door, "but Whiskers had another terrible night. I think something's really wrong." The cat carrier contained a noticeably thinner version of the Whiskers Marjorie remembered. His usual bright eyes were dull, and he pressed himself against the back of the carrier as if trying to disappear. Even through the metal bars, she could see he was trembling. "How long has he been like this?" Marjorie asked, gesturing for Eleanor to set the carrier on the kitchen table. 4 days now. It started suddenly. One day he was fine. The next, he was hiding under my bed and wouldn't come out. I thought maybe he'd eaten something that disagreed with him, but he won't touch his food at all. Marjorie opened the carrier and gently coaxed Whiskers onto the table. The cat allowed her to handle him, though he remained tense under her touch. His nose was dry, his coat had lost its usual luster, and she could feel that he'd lost weight. "Let me get my old examination kit," she said, disappearing into the spare room where she'd stored her veterinary supplies. The black leather bag felt foreign in her hands after 5 years of retirement, but her fingers still remembered the familiar weight of the stethoscope and thermometer. Whiskers submitted to the basic examination with resigned patience. His temperature was slightly elevated, and his heart rate was faster than normal, both consistent with stress or illness. But as Marjorie ran her hands along his body, checking for signs of pain or abnormalities, her fingers encountered something unexpected. There, hidden beneath the thick fur of his left shoulder, was a small raised area. It felt like scar tissue, the kind left by a surgical incision. But Eleanor had never mentioned Whiskers having surgery, and the scar felt old, well-healed. "Eleanor, has Whiskers ever had an operation? Any kind of surgery at all?" "No, never. He's been perfectly healthy his whole life." "Why?" Marjorie parted the orange and white fur more carefully, revealing a thin line of scar tissue about an inch long. "It was expertly done, barely visible unless you knew where to look. The kind of precise work that spoke of professional skill and deliberate concealment." "This is very strange," Marjorie murmured, more to herself than to Eleanor. "There's definitely been an incision here, but it's old. Months, maybe years." Something cold settled in her stomach as she continued to examine the scar. The technique was familiar, too familiar. She'd seen work like this before, precise and minimal, designed to heal with almost no visible trace. It was the kind of surgery that required expertise and a specific purpose. It was the kind of surgery that Thomas used to perform, but that was impossible. Thomas had been dead for 30 years, and Whiskers was only 6 years old. Besides, Eleanor had gotten the cat from the local animal shelter, not from their old practice. "Can you tell what it's from?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with worry. "Marjorie's." Hands were trembling slightly as she continued to probe the area around the scar. There was something beneath the skin, something small and hard, like a foreign object that hadn't been removed. "I think," she said carefully, "there might be something under his skin, something that was placed there intentionally." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither woman wanted to examine too closely. In all her years of practice, Marjorie had never encountered anything quite like this. Animals occasionally swallowed foreign objects that required surgical removal, but this felt different. This felt deliberate. "What kind of something?" Eleanor whispered. Marjorie met her neighbor's frightened eyes and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "I think we need to find out." The decision to perform the minor surgery weighed heavily on Marjorie's mind as she prepared her makeshift operating area on the kitchen table. She hadn't done this kind of work in 5 years, and her hands felt less steady than she remembered. But something about the scar's placement and the object beneath Whisker's skin demanded investigation. Eleanor paced nervously by the window, while Marjorie administered a light sedative to calm the cat. Within minutes, Whiskers relaxed into a drowsy state that would allow for the procedure without causing him distress. "Are you sure about this?" Eleanor asked for the 3rd time. "No," Marjorie admitted, adjusting the desk lamp she'd positioned over the table. "But whatever's under his skin is causing him discomfort, and it doesn't belong there." The incision took only minutes. Her muscle memory guided the scalpel along the old scar line, opening the healed tissue with practiced precision. Beneath the skin and a thin layer of connective tissue, her fingers found what felt like a small, hard cylinder. "There," she whispered, extracting the object with surgical forceps. "Got it." What she held made no immediate sense. It was a tiny capsule, perhaps an inch long and no thicker than a pencil, made of what appeared to be waterproof material. The key surface was smooth and unmarked, giving no indication of its purpose or origin. Eleanor leaned closer, squinting at the strange object. "What in heaven's name is that?" Marjorie's mind raced through possibilities. Medical implants? Some kind of identification chip? But the placement was wrong for either of those purposes, and the size was unusual. Besides, Eleanor would have known if Whiskers had received any kind of medical device. "I have no idea," Marjorie said, quickly closing the small incision with a few precise stitches. But it was definitely placed there intentionally. While Whiskers recovered from the sedative, Marjorie examined the capsule more closely. One end appeared to have a small seam, suggesting it could be opened. With careful pressure, she managed to separate the 2 halves. Inside was a tightly rolled piece of paper, no larger than a fortune from a Chinese cookie. The paper was yellowed with age, but had been protected from moisture by the capsule's waterproof seal. As she unrolled it, her hands began to shake. The handwriting was unmistakable. Small, precise letters in the careful script she'd seen on countless veterinary records and grocery lists. It was Thomas's handwriting, as familiar to her as her own reflection. "If you're reading this, then my time ran out before I could tell you the truth. The clinic wasn't just about healing animals. Some of us were helping in other ways, hiding things that needed to stay hidden. Check the old files, box marked Inventory 1992. Look for the names with red dots. They knew the risks, just like I did. There are others who will come looking. Be careful who you trust. The animals remember everything, even when we forget." The paper fluttered from her numb fingers to the table. Eleanor, who had been reading over her shoulder, sank into the nearest chair with a soft gasp. "That's Thomas's writing," Marjorie whispered, her voice barely audible. "But how is that possible? He died 30 years ago, and Whiskers is only 6 years old." The impossibility of it crashed over Marjorie like a cold wave. Her husband had been dead for 3 decades. She'd buried him, grieved him, and slowly built a new life without him. Yet here was proof, tangible, undeniable proof, that he had somehow known this moment would come, that he had planned for her to find this message. "I don't understand," she said, sinking into her own chair. "None of this makes sense." But even as she spoke, fragments of memory began surfacing. The late-night phone calls Thomas used to receive during their final years together. his unexplained absences, the way he'd become increasingly distant and preoccupied. She'd attributed it all to work stress and the normal challenges of a long marriage. But now she wondered if there had been something more. "What does he mean about the clinic not just being about healing animals?" Eleanor asked gently. Marjorie shook her head. "I don't know. We treated sick and injured animals. We performed routine surgeries, vaccinations, checkups. We never did anything unusual or secretive." But even as she said it, she realized that wasn't entirely true. During those final months before Thomas's death, there had been irregularities. Patients that came in after hours, animals she didn't recognize on the surgery schedule, bills that didn't quite match the work performed. At the time, she'd assumed it was Thomas's way of helping families who couldn't afford regular veterinary care, charity cases he was too modest to discuss. Now she wondered if there had been another explanation entirely. "The box he mentioned," Eleanor said. "Do you still have your old clinic files?" "Some of them. When I closed the practice, I kept the important records in storage boxes in my basement, but I haven't looked at them in years." The thought of going through those old files filled Marjorie with a mixture of dread and desperate curiosity. For 30 years, she'd accepted the official story of Thomas's death, a heart attack while making a late-night house call to a farm outside town. He'd been found the next morning by the farmer, slumped over the steering wheel of his truck. The autopsy had confirmed cardiac arrest, and while it had seemed sudden for a man of 52, it wasn't unheard of. But Thomas's message suggested there was more to the story. The phrase, "my time ran out," implied he'd known he was in danger, and his warning about people coming to look for something suggested his death might not have been the natural event everyone had believed. "There are others who will come looking," Eleanor repeated, reading from the note again. "Looking for what?" "I don't know," Marjorie said, but a chill ran down her spine. "And I'm not sure I want to find out." Whiskers stirred on the table, blinking. Slowly, as the sedative wore off, the small incision on his shoulder was barely visible beneath his fur, and he seemed more alert than he had in days. Whatever had been bothering him about the foreign object appeared to have been resolved. "At least he seems to be feeling better," Eleanor observed, but Marjorie was no longer thinking about the cat's recovery. Her mind was focused on the basement storage room where boxes of old clinic records waited in the darkness. Files that might contain answers to questions she'd never known to ask. Names with red dots that might explain why her husband had felt the need to hide messages in living animals. "Eleanor," she said slowly, "I think I need to go through those old files tonight. Do you want me to come with you?" Marjorie considered the offer. Part of her wanted the company and support, but another part recognized that whatever she was about to discover might be dangerous. Thomas's warning about being careful who to trust suggested that not everyone in their small town was who they appeared to be. "No," she said finally, "if Thomas was right about people coming to look for something, then it's better if you're not involved. The less you know, the safer you'll be." Eleanor nodded reluctantly. "But if you need anything at all, call me. I don't care what time it is." After Eleanor left with a much improved Whiskers, Marjorie sat alone in her kitchen, staring at the tiny piece of paper that had upended her understanding of her own life. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the table where she'd just performed her first surgery in 5 years. Somewhere in her basement, in a box marked Inventory 1992, were files that might explain why her husband had died, with secrets she'd never suspected. Files that contained names marked with red dots, people who had apparently known risks that Thomas had shared. As evening approached, Marjorie made herself a simple dinner, though she had little appetite. The weight of impending discovery sat heavy in her chest. Part of her wanted to burn the note and pretend this afternoon had never happened. She could return to her quiet retirement, her predictable routines, her carefully constructed peace, but she knew she couldn't. After 30 years of wondering why Thomas had grown so distant in those final months, why he died alone on a dark country road, she finally had a thread to pull. Whatever unraveled in the process, she owed it to his memory and to herself, to learn the truth. The basement beckoned, filled with shadows and secrets that had waited 3 decades to be discovered. The basement of Marjorie's house had always been Thomas's domain. Even after his death, she'd rarely ventured down the narrow wooden stairs, preferring to leave the storage area untouched, like a shrine to their shared past. Now, standing at the top of the steps with a flashlight in hand, she felt like an intruder in her own home. The smell hit her first. Musty cardboard mixed with the faint medicinal scent that had always clung to Thomas's work clothes. Down here, surrounded by boxes labeled in his careful handwriting, it was easier to imagine he might walk through the door at any moment, apologizing for being late and asking what was for dinner. She found the box marked Inventory 1992, wedged between 2 larger containers near the back wall. It was heavier than expected, filled with file folders that had yellowed around the edges. As she carried it upstairs to the kitchen table, her back reminded her that she wasn't 25 anymore. Under the bright kitchen lights, the contents of the box seemed unremarkable at first glance. Standard veterinary records, supply invoices, vaccination schedules, the mundane paperwork that had kept their practice running. But as Marjorie began sorting through the files more carefully, she noticed patterns that hadn't been apparent 30 years ago. Many of the client files contained animals she didn't remember treating, dogs and cats with names like Shadow, Midnight, and Phantom, animals that, according to the records, had received routine care but whose owners were listed only by initials or obviously false names. More troubling, the billing information for these patients was inconsistent. Some showed payments in cash, others had no payment records at all. Then she found the red dots. They were small, barely visible marks made with a red pen next to certain client names. At first, she thought they might indicate overdue accounts or problem customers, but as she cross-referenced the marked files with Thomas's appointment calendar, a different pattern emerged. The red dot clients always came in after regular hours. They never brought the same animal twice. And according to the records, Thomas had performed minor surgical procedures on nearly all of them, procedures that seemed unnecessary for healthy animals. One file in particular caught her attention. The client was listed as J. Morrison, and the animal was described as a 3-year-old German Shepherd named Rex. According to Thomas's notes, Rex had received a routine subcutaneous injection and had been observed overnight for standard post-procedure monitoring. But Marjorie remembered Rex. She remembered him clearly because German Shepherds weren't common in their practice, and this particular dog had been unusually well-trained and calm. What she didn't remember was any injection or overnight stay. In her recollection, Rex had come in for a simple wellness check and had left the same day. She pulled out more red dot files, and the same pattern repeated. Animals receiving procedures. She didn't remember staying overnight in kennels that should have been empty. Clients paying in cash for services that seemed medically unnecessary. "What were you doing, Thomas?" she whispered to the empty kitchen. As she continued searching, she found something that made her hands tremble. Hidden between 2 routine vaccination records was a leather-bound notebook she'd never seen before. The cover was worn smooth from handling, and Thomas's initials were embossed in faded gold letters on the front. Inside, page after page, detailed surgical procedures, written in Thomas's precise handwriting. But these weren't normal veterinary surgeries. Each entry described the implantation of small foreign objects, capsules, chips, and other devices in healthy animals. The locations were carefully mapped, the incision techniques meticulously documented. More disturbing were the notes that accompanied each procedure. Phrases like, "package delivered successfully," "client departed via alternate route," and "subject will be relocated within 48 hours." This wasn't veterinary medicine, this was something else entirely. One entry, dated just 3 weeks before Thomas's death, was particularly chilling. Final procedure completed on subject Whiskers, orange. Tabby, approximately 8 weeks old. Package contains urgent information regarding network exposure. If I don't return from tonight's meeting, M will find this when the time is right. The animals remember what we forget. Marjorie's breath caught in her throat. Whiskers, the same. Whiskers that Eleanor had brought to her just hours ago. But according to this entry, Thomas had implanted the capsule when the cat was just a kitten, 30 years ago. Eleanor had gotten Whiskers from the animal shelter 6 years ago, which meant the cat had lived with another family for over 2 decades. How was that possible? Cats rarely lived more than 15 years, and Whiskers was supposedly only 6. Unless she flipped through the journal looking for more clues and found them in Thomas's increasingly urgent final entries. He'd been using the animals as living storage devices, hiding information in creatures that would be placed with families around the county. The network he'd referenced in his note had apparently been far more extensive than she'd imagined. But the final entries in the journal told a different story. Thomas's handwriting became shakier, his notes more cryptic. References to being watched, phones tapped, and network compromised appeared with increasing frequency. The last entry, dated the day before his death, contained only a single line. They know. If something happens to me, the truth dies with me unless M finds the answers I've hidden. Marjorie closed the journal with shaking hands. The man she'd been married to for 23 years had been living a double life, using their veterinary practice as a front for activities she couldn't begin to understand. He'd been helping people hide information, possibly helping them disappear entirely, and in the end, someone had discovered what he was doing. The official cause of death had been a heart attack, but Thomas's journal painted a different picture. His references to being watched and phones being tapped suggested he'd known he was in danger. The timing of his death, just hours after his final journal entry, seemed far too convenient to be coincidental. She thought back to those last months, of their marriage, remembering signs she'd dismissed at the time. Thomas's insistence that she not answer the phone after dark, his habit of checking the locks multiple times before bed, the way he'd startled at unexpected noises. She'd attributed it all to stress from work, but now she realized he'd been afraid. And he'd been right to be afraid. The kitchen clock chimed 10 o'clock, startling her from her thoughts. She'd been reading for hours, and the weight of what she'd discovered was beginning to settle over her like a heavy blanket. Her husband hadn't just been keeping secrets. He'd been involved in something dangerous enough to get him killed, but what had he been hiding? And who had been willing to murder a small-town veterinarian to keep it secret? She gathered the files and journal into a neat stack, her mind racing. Thomas had mentioned other people in the network, people who had known the risks, just as he had. Some of those people might still be alive, might have answers to the questions that were multiplying in her mind. The red dots in the files weren't just marking special clients, they were marking co-conspirators, people who had trusted Thomas with their secrets and who might be willing to trust his widow with the truth. As she prepared to head upstairs to bed, Marjorie made a decision that would have terrified the woman she'd been that morning. Tomorrow, she would start making phone calls. She would track down the people behind those red dots and find out what had been worth dying for. But tonight, as she turned off the kitchen lights and climbed the stairs to her empty bedroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer alone in the house. Somewhere in the shadows, the ghosts of 30 years ago were stirring, awakened by the truth she'd finally begun to uncover. Sleep eluded Marjorie that night. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of wind through the trees outside her bedroom window, made her wonder if Thomas's warnings about people coming to look were about to prove prophetic. By dawn, she'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. She was going back to the clinic. The building that had once housed Lane Animal Clinic sat on the edge of Millbrook's small downtown district, a modest brick structure that had been converted into Memory's antique shop after Marjorie sold it. But she still had a key. The new owners had never bothered to change the locks on the basement storage area where she'd left some old equipment too heavy to move. Driving past the familiar storefront at 7 in the morning brought a rush of bittersweet memories. The hand-painted sign that had once read Lane Animal Clinic had been replaced with weathered wood declaring antiques and collectibles, but the building's bones remained the same. She parked in the alley behind the shop, using the rear entrance she'd walked through thousands of times during her working years. The basement was exactly as she'd left it 5 years ago, dusty, dim, and filled with the ghosts of her former life. Old examination tables covered with canvas tarps, boxes of outdated medical supplies, and filing cabinets that had been too cumbersome to move. But it was the far corner that drew her attention now, the area where Thomas had kept his private office supplies. She'd never paid much attention to that corner during their working years. Thomas had always been particular about his filing system, and she'd respected his need for organization. Now, armed with knowledge from his journal, she began to see his organization in a different light. Behind a stack of supply boxes, she found what she was looking for. A small wall safe she'd forgotten existed. Thomas had installed it years ago, claiming they needed secure storage for controlled substances and emergency cash. The combination, she remembered, had been their wedding anniversary. The safe opened with a click that seemed unnaturally loud in the silent basement. Inside, her flashlight revealed contents that made her stomach clench with anxiety. Stacks of cash, far more than any small veterinary practice would need for emergencies. A collection of false identification documents bearing Thomas's photograph, but different names, and most disturbing of all, a manila envelope containing photographs of people she didn't recognize. The photos appeared to be surveillance shots. Men and women photographed from a distance, some getting into cars, others entering buildings. On the back of each photo, Thomas had written dates and brief notes. Relocated to Denver, new identity established, family secured. At the bottom of the envelope was a folded piece of paper that, when opened, revealed a hand-drawn map of the county. Red X marks dotted the map at various locations, farms, houses, and businesses scattered throughout the rural area. Next to each X was a number that corresponded to entries in a small notebook she found tucked beneath the cash. The notebook contained what could only be described as a directory of safe houses and contacts. Names, addresses, and coded phrases that would apparently identify members of whatever network Thomas had been part of. Some entries were marked active, others compromised, and a few carried the ominous notation terminated. Her hands shook as she flipped through the pages, trying to make sense of the scope of what her husband had been involved in. This wasn't the work of a small-town veterinarian with a generous heart. This was an organized operation, carefully planned and meticulously documented. One entry near the back of the notebook made her blood run cold. M. Lane, wife, unaware of operations. Potential liability if network exposed. Recommend relocation protocols if situation deteriorates. Thomas had been planning to send her away. He'd known his activities might put her in danger, and he'd been prepared to uproot her entire life to keep her safe. The distance she'd felt in their marriage during those final months hadn't been emotional withdrawal, it had been protection. A sound from upstairs made her freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor above her head. The antique shop wouldn't open for hours, and the owners lived across town. Someone else was in the building. Marjorie quickly gathered the contents of the safe, stuffing everything into her purse with trembling fingers. The footsteps upstairs had stopped, but she could hear the faint sound of drawers being opened and closed. Someone was searching the shop, and she had a terrible feeling they weren't looking for antiques. She closed the safe and replaced the boxes that had hidden it, trying to leave everything exactly as she'd found it. The basement had a second exit, a easy set of stairs that led directly outside, but she'd have to cross the open floor to reach them. If someone was watching the building, they'd see her emerge. The footsteps upstairs resumed, moving toward the front of the building. This was her chance. She crept across the basement floor, wincing at every creak of the old wooden boards beneath her feet. The outside stairs were steep and narrow, but they led to an area shielded from view by an old delivery truck that hadn't moved in years. She made it to her car without being seen, but as she drove away, she caught a glimpse of a dark sedan parked on the street in front of the antique shop. The driver appeared to be watching the building, and something about his posture suggested this wasn't a casual observer. Thomas's warnings were proving accurate. People were indeed looking, and they'd started with the clinic where it all began. Back home, Marjorie spread the contents of the safe across her kitchen table, trying to process the magnitude of what she'd discovered. The false IDs suggested Thomas had been prepared to disappear at a moment's notice. The surveillance photos indicated he'd been tracking people, either to help them or to monitor potential threats. And the directory of safe houses painted a picture of an underground railroad designed to hide people from dangers she couldn't begin to imagine. But who had they been hiding from? And why had a veterinarian been involved in what appeared to be witness protection activities? She found a partial answer in the last section of Thomas's notebook. A list of names under the heading Primary Threats included what appeared to be law enforcement officials, local politicians, and business leaders. People with the power to make others disappear permanently. One name on the list made her heart skip a beat. Sheriff Harold Brennan, the man who had investigated Thomas's death and ruled it a natural heart attack. According to Thomas's notes, Brennan had been compromised since 1985 and was actively hunting network members. The man who had assured her that Thomas's death was natural had been listed by her husband as a primary threat to the very network Thomas had died protecting. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across her kitchen table, Marjorie realized that her quiet retirement was over. She was now in possession of information that had gotten her husband killed, and the people responsible for his death were still out there, still searching for what Thomas had hidden. The question was no longer whether she was in danger, it was whether she could stay alive long enough to expose the truth. The photograph had been hidden between the pages of Thomas's notebook, so carefully concealed that Marjorie almost missed it. When it fluttered to the kitchen table, she found herself staring at an image that challenged everything she thought. She knew about her husband's final years. The faded color photograph showed Thomas standing with 3 other people outside what appeared to be a rural farmhouse. She didn't recognize the location, and more troubling, she didn't recognize the date written on the back. June 1994, final planning meeting. According to her memory, Thomas had been at a veterinary conference in Chicago that weekend. A trip she'd encouraged him to take for professional development. He'd lied to her, not just about where he was going, but about who he was meeting and why. The 3 people with Thomas looked ordinary enough: a middle-aged woman with graying hair, a younger man in work clothes, and an elderly gentleman who might have been a farmer. But their positioning in the photograph suggested a familiarity that spoke of long association. These weren't casual acquaintances. They were people Thomas had worked with closely. On the back of the photograph, beneath the date, Thomas had written 4 names: Margaret Chen, David Santos, Robert Fleming, and me. Below that, in smaller print, the last of the originals: God help us all. Using the directory Thomas had hidden in the safe, Marjorie was able to match the names to entries in his notebook. Margaret Chen was listed as active Denver relocation specialist. David Santos appeared under compromised last contact 1993. Robert Fleming's entry was marked with a single word that made Marjorie's blood run cold: terminated. But it was Margaret Chen's entry that gave her hope. Unlike the others, her information included a current phone number and an address in Colorado. If anyone could explain what Thomas had been involved in, it would be someone who had survived long enough to relocate to another state. The decision to call took Marjorie 3 hours to make. She paced her kitchen, rehearsing what she might say. To a stranger who had shared secrets with her dead husband, how do you begin a conversation about underground networks and hidden conspiracies? How do you explain that you've just discovered your marriage was built on foundations you never knew existed? Finally, as the afternoon sun began to slant through her kitchen windows, she dialed the number. The phone rang 4 times before a cautious voice answered. "Hello? Is this Margaret Chen?" A long pause. "Who's asking?" "My name is Marjorie Lane. I was married to Thomas Lane. I think you knew him." The silence that followed was so complete that Marjorie wondered if the connection had been lost. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Thomas is dead, Mrs. Lane. He died 30 years ago. I know, but I found some of his papers, and your name was in them. I think he was involved in something, and I need to understand what it was." Another pause, then, "Where did you find these papers?" Marjorie took a deep breath. "Hidden in a safe at our old clinic, along with photographs and other documents I don't understand." "Mrs. Lane, I'm going to ask you a very important question, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Have you told anyone else about what you found?" "No, only my neighbor knows that I found something in her cat, but she doesn't know the details." "Her cat?" "A cat named Whiskers. Thomas had implanted a capsule with a message for me. That's how this all started." The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line told Marjorie that Margaret understood the significance of what she'd just described. "Mrs. Lane, you need to listen to me very carefully. The people who killed your husband are still out there, and if they know you've found what he hid, your life is in danger. Do you understand?" The words hit Marjorie like a physical blow. She'd suspected Thomas's death wasn't natural, but hearing it confirmed by someone who had known him in his secret life made it real in a way that mere speculation hadn't. "Why?" she whispered. "What was he involved in?" "Not over the phone. Never over the phone. Do you have somewhere safe you can go? Somewhere these people wouldn't think to look?" Marjorie's mind raced. Her house was obviously known to anyone who had been watching Thomas. Eleanor's house next door would offer no real protection. She had family in other states, but involving them would only put more people at risk. "I don't know," she admitted. "There's a motel in Riverside, about 40 minutes north of where you are. The Pine Valley Inn. Check in under the name Sarah Mitchell. That's important. Use exactly that name. Tell the clerk you're visiting family and you'll be staying for several days. Pay cash. Don't use credit cards or checks." "How do you know where I am?" "Because I helped set up the safe houses in your county, Mrs. Lane. I know that area better than you might think. Can you get to Riverside tonight?" Marjorie looked around her kitchen at the comfortable routine of her retirement that had been shattered in less than 24 hours. Everything she'd thought she knew about her life, her marriage, and her husband's death was crumbling around her. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I can be there tonight." "Good. I'll drive down from Denver tomorrow. We'll meet at the diner across from the motel at 10 in the morning. And Mrs. Lane, don't trust anyone. From your local law enforcement. Thomas died because someone in authority was feeding information to the wrong people." The line went dead, leaving Marjorie alone with the weight of what she'd just committed to. She was about to abandon her home, her comfortable routine, and her safe retirement to meet a stranger who claimed to know why her husband had been murdered. But as she looked at the photograph of Thomas with his 3 companions, she realized she'd already made the choice the moment she opened that first capsule. There was no going back to ignorance, no returning to the peaceful fiction of her widowhood. She spent the next hour packing a small suitcase with clothes and necessities, moving through her house like someone preparing for a long journey with no certain destination. The contents of Thomas's safe went into a manila envelope that she tucked into her purse, alongside the photograph and his notebook. As the sun set behind the trees lining Maple Street, Marjorie Lane locked the door of the house where she'd lived. for 40 years and walked away from the only life she'd ever known. Behind her, curtains twitched in neighboring windows, but she didn't look back to see who might be watching. The road to Riverside stretched ahead in the gathering darkness, leading toward answers she wasn't sure she was ready to hear. The Pine Valley Inn was exactly the kind of place Margaret had chosen deliberately, small, unremarkable, and run by people who minded their own business. Marjorie checked in as Sarah Mitchell, paying cash for 3 nights while trying to project the confidence of someone visiting relatives rather than fleeing for her life. The room was clean but dated, with floral wallpaper that had seen better decades and a window that looked out over the parking lot. She spent a restless night, listening to trucks rumble past on the highway, jumping at every sound that might indicate she'd been followed. The diner across the street was busier than she'd expected for a Thursday morning. Local workers grabbed coffee and breakfast before heading to jobs at the lumber mill and nearby farms. Marjorie chose a corner booth with a clear view of both the entrance and the parking lot, ordering coffee she didn't want while she waited. Margaret. Chen arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, and Marjorie recognized her immediately, despite 30 years of aging. The woman in the photograph had been perhaps 50. The woman sliding into the opposite side of the booth was clearly in her 80s, but her eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had been evident even in the old snapshot. "Mrs. Lane," Margaret said quietly, extending a weathered hand. "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. Thank you for coming. And please call me Marjorie." Margaret's gaze swept the diner with practiced casualness before returning to Marjorie's face. "You said you found documents in Thomas's safe. I need to know exactly what you discovered." Over the next 20 minutes, Marjorie detailed everything. The capsule in whiskers, Thomas's journal, the safe at the clinic, the surveillance photographs, and the directory of safe houses. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly grave. "The phone Thomas hid," Margaret said when Marjorie finished. "Do you still have it?" "Phone?" Marjorie frowned. "I didn't find any phone. He always carried a second phone. A burner, we called them. If you found everything else but not the phone, then someone else has it." The implication sent a chill through Marjorie. "Someone was searching the antique shop yesterday morning. I saw them when I was leaving." Margaret nodded grimly. "They're faster than I hoped. Thomas's phone would have contained contact information for the entire network. If they have it, then everyone he worked with is in danger." What exactly was this network doing? Thomas's notes mention helping people relocate, but I don't understand why a veterinarian would be involved. Margaret's coffee sat untouched as she seemed to weigh how much to reveal. Finally, she began to speak in low, measured tones. "It started in the early 80s. There was a group of businessmen and officials in your county, powerful people who were involved in things that would have destroyed them if exposed. Drug trafficking, money laundering, worse things. They controlled local law enforcement, the courts, even some state positions." "Sheriff Brennan," Marjorie said, remembering the name from Thomas's threat list, among others. When people tried to come forward, witnesses, former employees, family members who knew too much, they had a habit of disappearing or dying in convenient accidents. That's when some of us decided to fight back." Margaret paused as the waitress refilled their coffee cups, waiting until they were alone again before continuing. "We created an underground network to help these people disappear safely before they could be silenced permanently. New identities, relocation assistance, ongoing support. Thomas was crucial because he could implant tracking devices in animals that would be placed with witness families. If anything happened to the people we were protecting, we'd know immediately." The scope of what Margaret was describing overwhelmed Marjorie. "How many people did you help?" "Over 15 years. Maybe 200 families. Women fleeing abusive husbands with connections to the corruption ring. Accountants who'd discovered financial irregularities. Police officers who refused to look the other way. Anyone who posed a threat to the organization's operations. And Thomas was doing surgery on animals to help coordinate this. The animals were perfect carriers, Who would think to look for sensitive information in a family pet? Thomas could implant location devices, communication equipment, even data storage. The animals lived normal lives with their families while serving as a lifeline back to the network. Margaret reached into her purse and withdrew a small device that looked like an outdated cell phone. This is what we used for communication. Encrypted, untraceable, designed to look like old technology that no one would think twice about. Marjorie stared at the device. Thomas had one of these. Everyone in the network did. When someone died or disappeared, their phone would automatically send a signal to the rest of us. We'd know within hours if a member had been compromised. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Thomas knew he was going to die, didn't he? His final messages to the network indicated he'd been discovered. Someone had figured out what he was doing and was planning to silence him. He tried to shut down his operations and destroy the evidence, but they moved faster than he expected. Why didn't he just leave? You said you helped people relocate. Margaret's expression softened slightly. Because of you, Marjorie. He wouldn't abandon you, and he knew that trying to take you with him would have put you in even greater danger. So he stayed, hoping he could buy enough time to clean up his involvement and protect both you and the network. The waitress approached their table again, but Margaret waved her away with a subtle gesture. When they were alone, she leaned forward and spoke in an urgent whisper. The people who killed Thomas are still active, Marjorie. The corruption network adapted after we exposed some of them, but they didn't disappear. If anything, they became more careful and more ruthless. What do you mean? I mean that 3 other members of our network have died in the past 5 years, all ruled natural deaths or accidents, just like Thomas. But I don't believe in that many coincidences. Marjorie felt the diner walls closing in around her. They're still killing people. They're cleaning house, eliminating anyone who might have evidence of their past activities. The fact that you found Thomas's records means they've been searching for them for 30 years. But why now? Why are they suddenly able to find network members after all this time? Margaret's face darkened. Because someone is helping them. Someone who knows our methods, our safe houses, our communication protocols. Someone from the inside. The implications of betrayal within their own ranks hung heavy between them. If Margaret was right, then even the network that had once protected witnesses from the corruption ring had been infiltrated by the very people they'd been fighting. What do I do? Marjorie asked, hating the helplessness in her own voice. You have a choice to make, Margaret said quietly. You can take what you've learned and disappear. I can help you establish a new identity, relocate somewhere far from here. You could live out your remaining years in safety, or you can help me finish what Thomas started. The evidence he gathered is still out there, hidden in animals throughout your county. With that proof, we might finally be able to expose the people who killed him and bring them to justice. Marjorie looked out the diner window at the ordinary. Morning traffic. People going about their normal lives without knowing that corruption and murder had been happening in their communities for decades. Thomas had died trying to protect those people, trying to give victims a chance to escape and tell their stories. How long would it take to find all the evidence? Margaret smiled grimly. Thomas was thorough. If we can locate even half of what he hid, we'll have enough to bring down the entire network. Then let's get started. The discovery came purely by accident. While searching through Thomas's belongings that Margaret had helped her retrieve from a storage unit she'd forgotten existed, Marjorie found a small metal object wrapped in cloth at the bottom of an old medical bag. It was tarnished with age, but when she cleaned it off, she recognized it immediately. Thomas's medical bracelet, the one he'd worn every day of their marriage to alert medical personnel about his penicillin allergy. The same bracelet that had been returned to her with his other personal effects after his death, except this bracelet was different, heavier. And when she turned it over, she found something that made her blood run cold. A tiny GPS tracking device, no larger than a pill, embedded in the metal backing. "Margaret," she called, her voice barely steady, "you need to see this." Margaret examined the bracelet with the practiced eye of someone who had seen surveillance equipment before. "This is military grade," she said quietly. "The kind of tracking device that would have been cutting-edge technology 30 years ago. But why would Thomas have a GPS tracker in his medical bracelet? He wouldn't. Someone else put it there." Margaret's face had gone pale. "Marjorie, this changes everything. If Thomas was being tracked, then his death wasn't just murder. It was an assassination." The implications crashed over Marjorie like a wave. Someone had been monitoring Thomas's every movement, knowing exactly where he went and when. His final trip to the farm outside town, the one where he'd supposedly died of a heart attack, hadn't been a random house call. It had been a setup. Who could have done this, Marjorie asked? Who would have had access to this kind of technology? Law enforcement, military, federal agencies. Margaret set the bracelet down carefully, as if it might explode. The corruption network we were fighting had connections at levels we never fully understood. But the autopsy confirmed he died of a heart attack. Margaret met her eyes with a grim expression. There are ways to induce cardiac arrest that leave no traces. Drugs that mimic natural heart failure. Methods that would fool a routine autopsy, especially if the examiner wasn't looking for signs of murder. The room seemed to spin around Marjorie. For 30 years, she'd accepted the official story of Thomas's death, grieved him as a victim of natural causes, and built her life around the assumption that fate had simply taken him too early. Now she was learning that he'd been hunted, tracked, and executed by people with resources and connections that reached far beyond their small county. "There's something else," Margaret said, her voice heavy with reluctance. "Something I haven't told you about the night Thomas died." Marjorie braced herself for another revelation that would reshape her understanding of the past. "He called me that evening, used the emergency protocol we'd established for when someone was in immediate danger. He said he'd discovered who was feeding information to the corruption network, and he was going to confront them." Confront who? He wouldn't say over the phone, but he was supposed to call me again within 2 hours. When he didn't, I knew something had gone wrong. Margaret walked to the window of the motel room, gazing out at the parking lot with the wariness of someone who had spent decades looking over her shoulder. "I drove to your county that night, Marjorie. I was there when they found his body. I watched from a distance as they loaded him into the ambulance, as Sheriff Brennan took control of the scene, as they told you he'd died of natural causes. You were there." Marjorie's voice was barely a whisper. "I was there. And I was a coward. I should have spoken up, should have demanded a proper investigation, but I was terrified that if I revealed myself, I'd be next. So I stayed silent and let them cover up his murder." The weight of Margaret's guilt filled the small room like a physical presence. For 30 years, she'd carried the knowledge that Thomas had been murdered, while his widow believed he'd died naturally. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I think I know who Thomas was going to confront that night. And if I'm right, then we're dealing with something much bigger than local corruption." Margaret returned to the small table where she'd spread out copies of Thomas's documents. She pointed to a series of entries in his notebook that Marjorie had overlooked before, dates and times that seemed to correspond to federal investigations in their area. "Look at this pattern. Every time there was a federal investigation into local corruption, every time outside authorities got close to exposing the network, something happened. Witnesses disappeared, evidence was lost, investigators were reassigned." Marjorie studied the entries, seeing the pattern Margaret had identified. "You think someone in federal law enforcement was protecting the local network? I think Thomas discovered that the corruption went all the way to Washington. That night, he was going to confront someone he trusted. Someone he thought was on our side, but who had been working against us all along." The scope of the betrayal was staggering. If Margaret was right, then Thomas hadn't just been fighting local criminals and corrupt officials. He'd been up against a conspiracy that included federal agents, people with the authority and resources to make problems disappear permanently. But who? Who would Thomas have trusted enough to meet alone? Margaret pulled out a photograph Marjorie hadn't seen before, a group shot taken at what appeared to be a law enforcement conference. Thomas was in the background, but the focus was on three men in suits standing at a podium. This was taken 6 months before Thomas died. He was consulting with federal agents who were supposedly investigating the corruption network. One of these men convinced Thomas to trust him, to share information about our operations. Marjorie studied the faces in the photograph. One man looked familiar, though she couldn't place where she'd seen him before. The man on the left, Margaret continued, is Special Agent Robert Harrison. He was the lead investigator on the federal task force looking into organized crime in your county. Thomas met with him regularly, shared intelligence about the network's operations. And you think Harrison was working for the other side? I think Harrison was the other side. I think the federal investigation was a sham, designed to identify and eliminate people like Thomas who were interfering with the corruption network's operations. Margaret pointed to notations in Thomas's handwriting at the bottom of the photograph. See these numbers? They correspond to dates when network members died or disappeared. Thomas was tracking the pattern, realizing that every person who shared information with the federal task force ended up dead. The brutal logic of it was overwhelming. The very people Thomas had trusted to help fight corruption had been using his information to hunt down and eliminate his fellow network members. Harrison convinced Thomas to meet him that night, Margaret said. Told him they were close to making arrests, that they needed one final piece of evidence. Thomas went to that meeting believing he was helping to bring justice to the people who had terrorized his community for years. Instead, he was walking into his own execution. Yes, and the tracking device in his medical bracelet was how they made sure he couldn't escape once he realized the truth. Marjorie picked up the bracelet again, this time seeing it not as a medical necessity, but as the instrument of her husband's death. Someone had replaced his original bracelet with this modified version, turning his own precaution against medical emergencies into a tool for his assassins. 30 years, she said quietly. For 30 years his killers have been free, while I grieved him as a victim of natural causes. And they're still out there, Marjorie. Harrison retired from the FBI with full honors. The local corruption network adapted and evolved. They've been free to continue their operations because everyone who could have exposed them is dead. Everyone except us, Margaret nodded grimly. Everyone except us, and now they know we're looking into Thomas's death, which means we're running out of time. The medical bracelet sat on the table between them, 30 years of lies made manifest in a small piece of tarnished metal. Thomas had died, believing he was fighting for justice, never knowing that the very people he'd trusted had marked him for death. But his death had also provided them with evidence that could finally expose the conspiracy that had killed him. The tracking device proved premeditation, the timing proved coordination, and the scope of the cover-up proved that powerful people at multiple levels of government had been involved. "What do we do now?" Marjorie asked. Margaret's expression hardened with determination. "Now we finish what Thomas started. We gather the evidence he hid, we expose the conspiracy that killed him, and we make sure that his death finally serves the cause of justice he died believing in. Even if it gets us killed too? Especially then, because if we don't try, then Thomas died for nothing, and the people who murdered him will continue to murder others." Marjorie looked at the medical bracelet one more time, then carefully wrapped it back in its cloth and placed it in her purse. Evidence, proof, the key to finally bringing her husband's killers to justice. After 30 years of lies, it was time for the truth. The plan Margaret outlined over coffee at the diner was both elegant and terrifying in its simplicity. Thomas had hidden evidence in animals throughout the county, but according to his records, the most damning proof was contained in a single capsule, one that contained financial records, photographs, and recorded conversations that would expose the entire conspiracy. He called it the nuclear option. Margaret explained, spreading a hand-drawn map across the table. Everything needed to bring down not just the local network, but their federal protection as well. The map showed Thomas's final weeks, tracking his movements as he prepared for what he must have known would be his last mission. Red X marks indicated the locations where he'd hidden various pieces of evidence. But one mark stood out from the arrest, a circle drawn in heavy black ink around a farm on the outskirts of the county. The Morrison farm, Marjorie read from Thomas's notation. That's where he was found. And that's where he hid the final evidence package. He was trying to retrieve it when they killed him. Margaret pointed to a series of notes in Thomas's handwriting around the farm's location. He'd implanted the capsule in a dog belonging to the Morrison family 6 months earlier, but by the time he went back for it, the dog had been moved. Moved. Where? That's what we need to find out. The Morrisons sold their farm and moved away shortly after Thomas died. If we can track down that family and their dog, we might be able to recover the evidence that Thomas died trying to protect. The logistics of finding a family that had disappeared 30 years ago seemed overwhelming, but Margaret had come prepared. From her bag, she produced a folder containing property records, forwarding addresses, and even old phone bills that showed the Morrison family's contacts during their final months in the county. "You've been planning this for a long time," Marjorie observed. "I've been preparing for this for 30 years. Every year I told myself I'd finally do something about Thomas's death, and every year I convinced myself it was too dangerous. But when you called, when I learned that Thomas's evidence was finally surfacing, I realized I couldn't wait any longer." The weight of decades-old guilt was evident in Margaret's voice. She'd spent half her life carrying the knowledge of what had really happened, watching Thomas's killers live free while his widow grieved in ignorance. "Why didn't you contact me before? Why wait until now?" Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she folded the map. "Because I was afraid. Afraid that approaching you would put you in danger. Afraid that I'd waited too long and the evidence was lost forever. Afraid that I was just a frightened old woman chasing ghosts, and now I'm still afraid, but I'm more afraid of dying with this secret than I am of dying while trying to expose it." Their research over the next several hours painted a picture of a family that had indeed vanished into the federal witness protection system. The Morrisons had sold their farm at well below market value to a buyer who turned out to be a shell company. They'd left no forwarding address with neighbors, no contact information with local services, no trail that could be followed by ordinary means. But Thomas's records contained something the official investigators hadn't known about: the name and description of the dog that carried the final evidence package. Rex, a German shepherd, aged 3 at the time of Thomas's death, the same dog that Marjorie remembered from her review of the clinic files. If Rex was 3 when Thomas died, he'd be 33 now, Marjorie said. "That's impossible. Dogs don't live that long." "Unless he's not the same dog," Margaret replied. "Thomas was careful about breeding programs. Some of the animals in his network were parents or offspring of the primary carriers. If Rex had puppies before the family moved, one of them might carry the same implant." The possibility sent a chill through Marjorie. Thomas had been thinking generations ahead, planning for scenarios where his original carriers might die or disappear. He'd created a biological backup system that could preserve evidence for decades. Margaret's contacts in the Federal Witness Protection Monitoring Network, former allies who had never been exposed, provided the breakthrough they needed. The Morrison family had been relocated to Oregon under new identities, but they'd maintained contact with a sister in Kansas who knew nothing about their involvement with Thomas's network. "She agreed to meet with us," Margaret said, after a lengthy phone conversation. "Tomorrow afternoon. She doesn't know exactly where her brother's family ended up, but she has some of their belongings that were shipped to her for storage." "Including anything about their pets?" "That's what we need to find." "Out!" The drive to Kansas took most of the next day, giving Marjorie time to process the magnitude of what they were attempting. They were essentially conducting their own investigation into a 30-year-old murder, following leads that professional investigators had either missed or deliberately ignored. If they were successful, they'd have evidence that could bring down a conspiracy involving local, state, and federal officials. If they failed, they'd likely join the list of people who had died trying to expose the truth. Dorothy Morrison Kelly lived in a modest house on the outskirts of Topeka, surrounded by the kind of quiet suburban neighborhood where people minded their own business and didn't ask too many questions about visitors. She was waiting for them on her front porch when they arrived, a woman in her 70s whose worried expression suggested she'd been having second thoughts about the meeting. "You said on the phone that this was about my brother Jim," she said, as they settled into her living room. "He died 10 years ago. Heart attack." Margaret and Marjorie exchanged glances. Another convenient death. Another family member removed from the equation. "We're trying to understand what happened to him after he left the farm," Margaret explained carefully. "We think he might have witnessed something that put him in danger." Dorothy's expression hardened. "Jim never told me exactly what happened, but I could tell he was scared. Said there were people who wanted to hurt his family, and they had to disappear for a while. That was the last time I saw him. But he sent you some belongings." "A few boxes over the years. Things he couldn't take with him when they moved. Photo albums, some furniture, things like that." Dorothy led them to a spare bedroom, where several cardboard boxes were stacked against one wall. "I always hoped he'd come back for these someday. After he died, I didn't have the heart to go through them." The boxes contained the ordinary detritus of a family's life. Photograph albums, children's toys, household items that had been too bulky or sentimental to abandon. But in the third box, Marjorie found what she was looking for. A thick folder labeled Rex Veterinary Records contained vaccination certificates, medical records, and photographs of a beautiful German shepherd. But it was the breeding information that made Marjorie's heart race. Rex had indeed sired a litter of puppies just 2 months before the Morrison family disappeared. "Dorothy," Marjorie said carefully, "do you know what happened to Rex's puppies?" "Oh, those were given away before Jim moved. He couldn't take them all with him, so he found homes for them around the county. I think he kept one, but the rest went to local families." Margaret was already studying the breeding records. "There's a list here of the families who adopted the puppies, names and addresses. 7 puppies, 7 families scattered throughout the county they'd just left. If Thomas's backup plan had worked, one of those puppies would carry the same evidence package that had been implanted in its father." "Dorothy, this is very important," Margaret said. "Do you remember anything else your brother said about why he had to leave? Anything about the people who were threatening him?" The older woman's face clouded with memory. "He said something once about a veterinarian who'd tried to help him. Said the vet was a good man who'd gotten mixed up in something dangerous. But then the vet died, and Jim knew they'd be coming for him next." Marjorie felt tears sting her eyes. Thomas had indeed been trying to protect the Morrison family, and his death had prompted their entry into witness protection. His murder had saved their lives, even as it cost him his own. "We need to get back," Margaret said quietly. "If one of those puppies is still alive, still with its adoptive family, we might be able to recover what Thomas died trying to protect." The drive back to their home county felt different now. They were no longer just investigating the past. They were racing against time to recover evidence before Thomas's killers realized what they were looking for. Somewhere in a small farming community, a 30-year-old dog, or its offspring, carried proof that could finally bring justice for Thomas's murder. But they weren't the only ones searching. As they crossed the county line, Marjorie noticed the same dark sedan that had been parked outside the antique shop several days earlier. It maintained a careful distance, but its presence was unmistakable. "We're being followed," she told Margaret. Margaret checked the rearview mirror and nodded grimly. "Then we're getting close. They wouldn't be watching us this carefully unless they knew we were on the right track. What do we do?" We stick to the plan. We find that dog, we recover the evidence, and we expose the truth before they can stop us. And if they try to stop us, Margaret's hands tightened on the steering wheel, then we make sure the evidence survives even if we don't. The final confrontation was approaching, and they both knew it. 30 years after Thomas's death, the truth was finally within reach. But the people who had killed him were still out. There, still watching, still willing to commit murder to protect their secrets. Time was running out, and the stakes had never been higher. The Riverside Community Center had been Margaret's idea. A public place with multiple exits and enough people around to discourage violence. They'd arranged to meet the families who had adopted Rex's puppies under the pretense of researching the breeding history of German Shepherds in the area. It was a thin cover story, but it was the best they could manage under the circumstances. Of the 7 families on Thomas's list, 5 still lived in the county. 2 had moved away years ago, and their current whereabouts were unknown. But the 5 who remained had all agreed to bring their dogs, or in some cases, the offspring of the original puppies, to what they believed was an informal dog show and breeding discussion. Marjorie stood at the entrance to the community centre at 9 in the morning, watching as families arrived with their German Shepherds. Margaret had positioned herself near the back exit, maintaining communication through small radios they'd purchased at an electronics store. Both women were acutely aware that their followers from the previous day had not given up the surveillance. First, "Family just arrived," Marjorie murmured into her radio. "German Shepherd, looks to be about 10 years old, male. The Hendersons had adopted their puppy in 1994 and named him Duke. He was a beautiful dog, well cared for and clearly beloved by the elderly couple who had raised him." But when Marjorie ran her hands along his shoulders and flanks, feeling for the telltale signs of an old surgical scar, she found nothing. The second family brought a female named Lady, now 12 years old and moving slowly with the arthritis, common to her breed. Again, Marjorie's examination revealed no signs of surgical implantation. By the time the third family arrived, Marjorie was beginning to worry that they were chasing shadows. Perhaps Thomas's backup plan had failed. Perhaps the evidence package had been discovered and removed years ago. Perhaps they were risking their lives for information that no longer existed. Then the Schneiders walked in with Max. Max was enormous, even by German Shepherd standards, and his coloring was identical to the photographs of Rex in the Morrison family's veterinary records. But more importantly, when Marjorie began her examination, her fingers immediately found what she was looking for, a small raised area beneath the thick fur of his left shoulder, the same location where Thomas had hidden the capsule in whiskers, the same expert surgical technique that left barely a trace unless you knew where to look. "Margaret," she whispered into her radio, "I think we found him." "Are you certain?" Marjorie's hands trembled as she continued to probe the area around the scar. The capsule beneath Max's skin was larger than the one she'd found in Whiskers, and it felt different, heavier, more substantial. "Mrs. Schneider," she said to Max's owner, "has Max ever had any kind of surgery? Any medical procedures that might have left a scar?" The middle-aged woman shook her head. "Never. He's been healthy his whole life." "Why do you ask?" Before Marjorie could answer, Margaret's voice crackled urgently through the radio. "We have company. 3 men in suits just entered through the back entrance. They're not here for the dog show." Marjorie's blood turned to ice. The men Margaret had spotted could only be operatives sent to stop them from recovering Thomas's evidence. After 30 years, they were finally close enough to the truth to warrant a direct confrontation. "Mrs. Schneider," Marjorie said urgently, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Your dog is carrying something that doesn't belong to him, something that was placed there when he was a puppy. I need to remove it, and I need to do it right now." The woman's face went pale. "I don't understand. What are you talking about?" "There are people here who want to hurt Max to get what he's carrying. If you trust me, if you want to keep him safe, Then let me help him." Mrs. Schneider looked around the community center, perhaps noticing for the first time that some of the other attendees weren't behaving like dog enthusiasts. Several men in casual clothes were positioning themselves near the exits, and their attention was focused on Marjorie rather than the animals. "What do you need me to do?" Marjorie quickly explained the situation while pulling a small surgical kit from her bag, supplies she'd brought in case they found Thomas's evidence and needed to extract it immediately. Mrs. Schneider held Max steady while Marjorie administered a local anesthetic around the surgical site. "Movement near the front entrance," Margaret's voice reported. "They're trying to surround us." The community center had been chosen for its multiple exits, but it was becoming clear that their pursuers had anticipated that strategy. If they were going to escape with Thomas's evidence, they needed to move quickly. The incision took only minutes, but it felt like hours, with the knowledge that armed men were closing in around them. Marjorie's hands remained steady despite her fear, guided by decades of veterinary experience and the desperate need to complete what Thomas had started. The capsule that emerged from beneath Max's skin was indeed larger than the one she'd found. In whiskers. It was made of the same waterproof material, but this one was clearly designed to hold significantly more information. "Got it," she whispered into the radio. "Time to go. They're moving." Marjorie quickly closed the small incision with surgical glue and gathered her supplies. Mrs. Schneider watched with wide eyes as the reality of the situation became clear. "Are we in danger?" she asked. "Not if we leave right now. Take Max and go out the side entrance. Drive straight to the police station and don't stop for anyone." "What about you?" Marjorie looked around the community center, noting the positions of the men who were trying to appear casual while clearly coordinating their movements. The memorial bell in the center's main hall, installed to honor local veterans, suddenly seemed like more than just a decoration. "I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth," she said, pulling the capsule from her bag and holding it up for everyone in the room to see. "Ladies and gentlemen," she called out in a voice that carried across the entire hall, "my name is Dr. Marjorie Lane, and 30 years ago my husband was murdered for trying to expose corruption in this county." The bell, when she rang it, resonated through the building with a clear, sustained tone that seemed to command attention from everyone present. The sound carried beyond the walls, drawing curious onlookers from the street outside. "The evidence of his murder and the conspiracy that killed him is in this capsule. And before anyone tries to stop me, I want everyone here to witness what Thomas Lane died trying to reveal." The contents of Thomas's final capsule spilled across the community center's registration table like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that had been waiting 30 years to be assembled. Photographs, financial records, audio recordings on tiny digital devices, and handwritten notes, all protected by waterproof packaging that had preserved them perfectly despite 3 decades inside a living animal. Marjorie's hands shook as she spread the evidence before the growing crowd of onlookers. The memorial bell had done its work. People from the street had gathered to see what the commotion was about, and several had already begun recording with their phones. "These photographs," she announced, holding up images that showed Sheriff Brennan accepting envelopes of cash from men in expensive suits, document corruption that goes back 40 years. Margaret had positioned herself near the audio equipment used for community events, and she managed to activate the system just as one of the men in suits moved to stop Marjorie's impromptu revelation. "Don't take another step," Margaret called. Her voice amplified through the center's speakers. "We're live streaming this to social media. Anything you do now will be witnessed by hundreds of people." The threat was effective. The men who had been closing in on Marjorie stopped their advance, clearly uncertain how to proceed when their actions were being broadcast in real time. Marjorie took advantage of the pause to examine Thomas's most damning evidence, a collection of audio recordings that had been converted to the digital storage devices of the early 1990s. The quality was poor by modern standards, but the voices were clear enough to identify. "This recording," she said, inserting one of the devices into a portable player she'd found among the community center's equipment, was made by my husband 3 weeks before his death. Sheriff Brennan's voice filled the room, discussing payment, schedules, and the elimination of problem witnesses with someone Marjorie didn't recognize. But it was the third voice on the recording that made her stomach clench with recognition. Special Agent Robert Harrison, the federal investigator who had supposedly been fighting corruption in their county, was clearly coordinating the cover-up. Operations with local officials. The Morrison family needs to disappear permanently, Harrison's voice said through the speakers. They know too much about the drug operations, and they won't be bought off like the others. What about the veterinarian? Brennan's voice responded. He's been asking too many questions. Lane is a problem, but he's also our key to finding the other network members. Let him run his little underground railroad for now. When we've identified everyone involved, we'll clean house all at once. The recording continued for several more minutes, detailing plans to eliminate Thomas's entire network once they'd extracted enough information to locate all the members. It was clear that Thomas had been allowed to operate specifically so that his activities would expose his fellow conspirators. Thomas discovered he was being used, Marjorie told the silent crowd. He realized that every person he tried to help was being tracked down and killed. So he recorded this evidence and hid it where he knew I would eventually find it. One of the men in suits had apparently decided that the situation was beyond salvage. He began speaking urgently into a radio, calling for backup or extraction. But his movement caught the attention of someone in the crowd who recognized him. "That's Deputy Martinez," called out an elderly woman whom Marjorie recognized from the church. "He works for the sheriff's department." The identification broke whatever spell had been keeping the crowd passive. People began pointing and talking, recognizing other men in the room as local law enforcement officers they'd thought they could trust. Margaret's voice carried over the growing noise. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're witnessing is the exposure of a conspiracy that has corrupted this county for 40 years. These men killed Dr. Thomas Lane to keep him from revealing their crimes, and they've been killing witnesses and whistleblowers ever since." The weight of evidence was overwhelming. Thomas's photographs showed money changing hands, documents revealed. Shell companies used to launder drug profits, and the audio recordings captured planning sessions for multiple murders. But it was the final piece of evidence that provided the most damning proof. A complete copy of Thomas's medical bracelet GPS tracking data, showing his exact movements in the hours before his death. The data proved that he'd been monitored as he drove to what he believed was a meeting with a federal ally, and it showed the precise moment when his vehicle had been forced off the road at the location where his body was later found. "This is the evidence that my husband died trying to protect," Marjorie said, her voice carrying clearly through the community center's sound system. "This is proof that Thomas Lane was murdered by the very people who were supposed to serve and protect this community." The crowd's mood had shifted from curiosity to anger as the scope of the betrayal became clear. These weren't distant criminals or faceless federal agents. These were people they'd trusted, voted for, and relied upon for protection. Deputy Martinez made a move toward Marjorie, but he was blocked by several community members who had positioned themselves between him and the evidence table. "You're not taking anything," declared Frank Muller, a local farmer whose family had lived in the county for generations. "We've heard enough lies. It's time for the truth." The confrontation that Thomas had died trying to precipitate was finally happening. After 30 years of cover-ups and murders, the corruption network was being exposed in front of the very community they had betrayed. But Marjorie knew that revealing the truth was only the beginning. The real test would be whether justice could finally be served, or whether the conspiracy would find new ways to protect itself, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. The memorial bell continued to ring in the background, its clear tone carrying across the county like a call to conscience that could no longer be ignored. 6 months after the community centre revelation, Marjorie stood in the same building where she'd exposed her husband's killers. But the atmosphere now was one of celebration rather than confrontation. The walls were decorated with photographs documenting the transformation that had swept through the county: new leadership, federal investigations, and most importantly, justice for victims who had waited decades for their stories to be heard. Today, the trial of Sheriff Brennan and his co-conspirators had lasted 3 months and resulted in convictions that sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across 3 states. Federal Agent Robert Harrison, now revealed as the architect of a protection racket that had enabled organized crime for 40 years, faced life in prison without the possibility of parole. The evidence Thomas had died protecting had proven even more comprehensive than anyone had imagined, but it was the smaller victories that meant the most to Marjorie. Families who'd been forced to disappear into witness protection were finally able to reclaim their identities. Children who had grown up wondering why their parents had suddenly uprooted their lives now understood the courage it had taken to stand against corruption. And most importantly, Thomas's name had been cleared of the suspicions that had surrounded his secretive final years. Margaret Chen sat beside Marjorie at the head table, looking more at peace than she had in decades. The guilt that had haunted her since the night of Thomas's murder had finally been replaced by the satisfaction of seeing justice served. Around them, the community that had been betrayed by its own protectors was learning to trust again. "I keep thinking Thomas would have been amazed by all this," Margaret said quietly. "He always believed that truth would eventually surface. But I don't think even he imagined it would take 30 years. Marjorie nodded, fingering the small memorial. A pin she now wore, a replica of Thomas's veterinary license that had been restored to honor after the truth emerged. The state licensing board had issued a formal apology for the suspicions that had been cast on his practice, acknowledging that his unconventional methods had actually been heroic efforts to protect vulnerable people. "He would have been proud of what we accomplished," she replied, "but I think he'd be even prouder of what comes next." The what comes next was the reason for tonight's gathering. The Thomas Lane Memorial Foundation had been established with funds recovered from the corruption network's seized assets, and its mission was to support whistleblowers and witnesses who found themselves in danger for speaking truth to power. The foundation would provide legal support, protection services, and relocation assistance, essentially continuing the work that Thomas and his network had begun 40 years earlier. Dr. Sarah Rodriguez, a young veterinarian who had taken over. The practice that now operated out of a new building on Main Street stood to address the crowd. The Thomas Lane Memorial Scholarship will support veterinary students who demonstrate a commitment to serving their communities, regardless of their ability to pay. We want to ensure that Dr. Lane's legacy of compassion and courage continues in the next generation. The scholarship was Marjorie's idea, born from her realization that Thomas's greatest gift hadn't been his willingness to fight corruption, but his ability to see the humanity in every creature that needed his help. The animals he had treated, the people he had protected, the community he had served, all had benefited from his conviction that every life had value and deserved protection. Eleanor Henderson, now 82, and still Marjorie's next-door neighbor, raised her hand from the audience. "What about Whiskers? Is he officially retired from detective work?" The question brought laughter from the crowd, but it also reminded everyone of how the truth had first emerged. Whiskers, now healthy and content after his surgery, had become something of a local celebrity. Children stopped by Eleanor's house regularly to pet the cat who had helped solve a 30-year-old murder. "Whiskers has earned his retirement," Marjorie replied with a smile, "though I suspect he'd be willing to come out of retirement if any other mysteries need solving." As the evening progressed, people shared stories about how the exposure of the corruption network had changed their lives. Families reunited after decades of separation. Business owners who had been driven out by extortion were returning to rebuild. Young people who had left the county seeking opportunities elsewhere were coming home to communities where honest work was no longer undermined by criminal enterprises. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Dorothy Morrison Kelly approached Marjorie near the end of the evening. She had driven from Kansas to attend the memorial, bringing with her something that completed the circle Thomas had created so many years before. "I wanted you to have this," Dorothy said, handing Marjorie a small wooden box. "It belonged to my brother Jim, but I think Dr. Lane would have wanted you to have it." Inside the box was a collar, clearly made for a large dog, with a brass nameplate that read, Rex. But more importantly, tucked inside the collar was a note in Jim Morrison's handwriting: "For Dr. Lane's family, thank you for giving us a chance to start over. Rex lived a good life because of your husband's courage." Marjorie held the collar gently, thinking about the chain of events that had led from Thomas's secret work to this moment of public recognition. Rex had lived his life not knowing that. He carried evidence that would eventually bring justice to his protector. The Morrison family had survived because Thomas was willing to risk everything to help them escape. And now, 3 decades later, their gratitude was finally able to reach the people who had made their survival possible. As the memorial gathering wound down, Marjorie found herself standing alone in the community center where everything had changed. 6 months earlier, the memorial bell stood silent now, but its message had been heard far beyond the boundaries of their small county. Margaret joined her, and together they looked at the display of photographs documenting Thomas's life and work. Images of him treating animals, working alongside Marjorie in their clinic, and standing with the network members who had trusted him with their lives. "Do you think he knew?" Margaret asked. "When he hid that final evidence, do you think he knew it would take this long for the truth to come out?" Marjorie considered the question, thinking about the man she had loved and lost, the secrets he had carried, and the courage he had shown in his final days. "I think he knew that truth has its own timeline," she said finally. "He trusted that when the time was right, when the right people found his evidence, justice would follow. He believed in the goodness of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when called upon. And he was right." "Yes," Marjorie said, watching as the last of the evening's attendees made their way home to families and communities that were finally free from the shadows of corruption. He was right. The Thomas Lane Memorial Foundation would continue his work. The scholarship would train new generations of compassionate veterinarians, and the truth he died protecting would serve as a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage can change the world. As Marjorie turned off the lights and locked the community center, she carried with her the knowledge that some stories never truly end. They just transform into new chapters of hope, justice, and the enduring power of love to transcend even death itself.